Happy New Year. Very good. 9:15 they were going, huh? Because somebody might be thinking, you might be sitting here thinking, okay, great. We were celebrating Thanksgiving. We're celebrating Christmas at Halloween. Maybe we're celebrating New Year's at Thanksgiving. But that's not really what we're doing. This is the beginning of the church year. Starting this Sunday, the first Sunday in Advent. This is a time of the year in the life of the church where for the next 6 months or so, we're going to focus on the life of Jesus. His birth, obviously in a couple of weeks. His birth, his life, his death on Good Friday, and especially we're going to focus on his resurrection on Easter Sunday. It's going to run for about the next 6 months into the first part of June as we progress through the church year. But this is the beginning of Advent. The season of Advent starts this morning. Advent is a season that was first begun, the Christian church first began celebrating it in the mid-500, about 500 years after the birth of Christ. And admittedly at the time, in about 500 AD or so, the season of Advent was a penitential time. It was much like the flavor of Lent. It was very somber. There wasn't a whole lot of celebrating. You didn't sing a whole lot of rejoicing. You really didn't sing Christmas carols. And forgive me if you were one of those people who liked Lent. It was kind of dismal. But today in the church, Advent is about hope. It's about a hope that is firmly anchored in Jesus coming on his first coming in here 2,000 years ago. But it's also about hope, a hope that we see and the hope that we have for God's future that he's going to create. But this morning is Isaiah, the reading which we had a moment ago. In these Advent sermons during the Sundays here in Advent for the next 4 weeks, Pastor Short and I are going to talk from Advent. Or talk from Isaiah, I'm sorry. Talk from Isaiah. And in Isaiah, what's happening here, Isaiah's writing about 750 years before the birth of Christ. And his day is in many ways like our day today. For 200 years or so, 250 years after the glory of David and after the glory of King Solomon, what had happened, the people as a nation began to trust in themselves. As a nation, they began to trust in how strong their army was and how great a people they were and how blessed they were. And they began to trust not in what God had done for them and what God was giving to them, as they began to trust in the fact that thinking, we're special, we're entitled to something. And what should have been a relationship based on trust and faith in what God had done for them and what God will do began being how good they were and how good they thought they were. But it wasn't just the nation. It was also individuals as well. One writer talked about Isaiah's time, and he said it was a country that was rotting from within. The people's relationship with God and the basis of society at Isaiah's day should have been trust in a God who brought them out of Egypt, who saved them, who brought them into the promised land. Trust in this God. But what had turned out to be, the nation had been full of addictions, greed, dishonesty, corruption, self-centered, and apathy. What should have been a people of God living in grace and living in truth and living in peace with each other had turned into a group of a nation that they were at war with each other, in fighting with each other, and literally at war with the nations and the people surrounding it. As I said, in many ways it's like today. 2 examples for you just right out of the headlines today. You gotta pray for President Obama, don't you? Right? He's got a war in Iraq, he's got a war in Afghanistan, and now he's got North Korea on it. A headache. Those of you old enough to remember. I'm not old enough to remember, but you're old enough to remember Korea. We've been down this road once. Okay? But the other thing is, another example of what's going on And don't get me wrong when I say this, all right? Celebrate Recovery. Celebrate Recovery is a wonderful ministry, and it's one of those ministries that's growing rapidly in churches and growing rapidly in churches around the country. That's the great news. The bad news is that Celebrate Recovery is a ministry that's growing in churches around the country. But so many people need it. And Isaiah's time was much like our time. And Isaiah could have come into these people and come to the people at this time and said, I told you so. God says, I told you so. But he doesn't do that. Isaiah comes with promises. And that's what our themes of our sermons are going to be for the next 4 weeks, is promises. The promises that God makes through Isaiah to his people at that day, and the same promises that God makes to us today. And the first promise that God has for us today is a promise of grace. That's a promise of grace. Now, one of the definitions of, what's the definition of grace? Well, one of the traditional definitions of grace that you've heard us say, and Pastor Short and I preach on, is you get what you do not deserve. You get what you do not deserve. And that's a good definition. That's a definition worth hanging on to. But I want to give you a different definition this morning. A little something different to help you expand what talking about grace. And that definition for grace is simply this: too good to be true. Too good to be true. What do I mean by too good to be true? Simply this. I don't know about your house, all right? But at my house Thursday, when you had your Thanksgiving dinner, at least at my house, I'm talking about, did anybody overeat besides me at your Thanksgiving? It seemed like right at Thanksgiving dinner you have a turkey, you may have ham with it, you have 4 different kinds of potatoes, 3 different kinds of green beans, 8 different kinds of salads, and that's just for the starters, and you get to dessert, right, and there's like 4 different kinds of pie. And so you sit at your Thanksgiving dinner, right? Say you sit at your Thanksgiving dinner and it seems like you eat forever. And you sit there at the end of the dinner and you're going, oh my gosh, what have I done? Right? And then your hostess sits there and says, surprise, I put a magical ingredient in the dinner. There's no calories in any of this. Too good to be true. Too good to be true. Too good to be true is winning the lottery when we're not smart enough to buy a ticket. But that's exactly what we've done. We've won God's lottery, and we didn't buy a ticket. Because God's lottery is called grace. God's lottery is called grace. What is grace? Grace is at the very beginning of the Bible when Adam and Eve eat of that fruit of the tree that they are not supposed to. Grace is the fact that God does not strike them dead, but goes one step farther as protects them and gives them clothes. Grace is the fact that when Cain kills his brother Abel, God does not exact an eye for an eye. Grace is God choosing Abraham. You might think, what's this Abraham guy? Abraham's nobody special. He was a nothing before he was called. He was really a nothing afterwards. Actually, he was a liar. And lied repeatedly. But yet God continued to call him. God continued to say, you are the chosen, Abraham. I want to make a nation through you. Grace is the fact that God calls his people, Israel. He says they're my children. Even after he leads them out of Egypt and leads them to Mount Sinai. Even after they're sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai and they hear God's voice. They see the majesty and glory of God on the top of the mountain. They hear his voice say, you shall have no other gods before me. And they sit there and they worship a golden calf. Grace is the fact that God says, you're my people. Grace is seen in David, that horrible story in the story with Bathsheba and Uriah, where he has adultery with Bathsheba and he kills the husband Uriah, and that whole terrible story. Grace is the fact that after that story is completed, God calls David a man after my own heart. That's grace. Grace is the parable of the prodigal son, where the father takes the shame, not only the shame of the younger son, but of the older son. Takes the shame of the younger son and sits there. The younger son says, oh, Father, I wish you were dead, and he leaves. The older son, when he doesn't want to go into the party and the celebration with his father, grace is the fact that the father loves both and invites both of them back into his celebration with him. That's grace. Grace is the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan stops, and it takes his time and his effort and his shame and his cost and his finance, and he pays the price that the man beaten on the side of the road would be picked up and be healed. Grace is the fact that we're the one on the side of the road and Jesus picks us up. Grace is Jesus on a cross when he's beaten within an inch of his life. Remember, he's very God of very God. He's the Son of God. He could sit there and he could strike anger, speak anger at all these people who have unjustly beaten him. But instead he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's grace. Grace is the Jesus and Peter. When Peter sits there and stabs the knife in Jesus' back, and then in the denial, just to make sure he gets it, twist the knife a couple of times. Grace is the fact that Jesus comes to Peter and says, feed my sheep. You see grace in the Gospels, in who Jesus is hanging out with. You read down through the Gospels and Jesus is hanging out with the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the sick, the lame, the rejects, the outcasts, the casts off, the beaten up and beaten down. That's who Jesus is hanging out with. Jesus is hanging out with us. This is the promise of God. This is grace. And many of us in life, and many of us can identify with these people that Jesus casts out. These ragamuffins of life that are beaten down and beaten up and cast off by life. It's Jesus' grace as Jesus hangs out with them. Jesus is hanging out and Jesus is with us. That's grace. In wonder of wonders, this promise of God comes from all places, a place called Jerusalem, and a hill outside Jerusalem called Calvary, and a hill outside Jerusalem where there is an empty tomb. And grace comes bursting forth, and the promise of God comes bursting forth from that spot and brings us to that spot. God has a promise of grace. But God has a promise of peace, which is the other promise that's in this passage, a promise of peace. As difficult as grace might be for me to describe what grace is, peace, I think, is even more difficult to describe. So I want to give you a couple of mental pictures of peace, if you can get a mental picture in your head. Picture, if you would, a mountain lake. It's a crystal clear blue sky, and there's a mountain lake in there. Now, if you've ever seen lakes, and especially mountain lakes, the water at times in a lake can get so still when there's no wind and no movement, and the water gets perfectly still. What happens is the water turns into a mirror. That's peace. That's the peace we're talking about. Another picture for you is, imagine a winter morning, one of those January winter mornings. It's been snowing all night. And you wake up the next morning and you open the blinds and you open it up and you look outside and there's that new fallen snow. The clouds have moved off and it's a crystal blue sky. And outside the house is covered with snow. And it's that deep snow that piles up. And it's that snow you look outside before anybody's ever out there, before the plows are through or anybody's walked. And all you see is that pure white cover of snow sparkling in the sunshine. That's peace. What's peace? This past weekend we were blessed at our house to have a house full. We had Betty's sister and her husband and their youngest, and we had Rachel and Anthony and their 5-year-old boy, Matthew. We had Matthew around. Matthew is a very energetic, very rambunctious 5-year-old boy. They left yesterday. You don't realize how noisy it is in your house with the 5-year-old boy until they leave. In the quiet and the peace. The 5-year-old boys and 5-year-olds are wonderful. Don't get me wrong. But isn't there noise and racket in our world? The noise and the racket that's going on in our world, the noise and the racket of commotion and stuff in the world and bad news and demands and everything going on in our world. Peace is that tranquility. Peace is that serenity. Peace is that calmness and that stillness that is quiet. A quiet that's not simply the noise, but it's a quiet that God puts in our hearts and in our lives and in our souls. Peace is a prosperity. It's a prosperity that's bigger than the money. It's bigger than status. It's a prosperity of the soul, and it's a prosperity of the spirit that God places inside us. Because He places inside us the Prince of Peace. He places inside us the one who is victorious. The angels say, He is not here, He's risen. That's who God places inside us. And in God's economy and in God's way of doing things, in God's irony of ironies, this peace, this tranquility, this serenity, this stillness of the soul comes to us through the violence of a cross. Through the violence of Jesus Christ crucified on a cross. It might seem in your world today that the whole world is against you. It might seem that every day you're having a long string of Mondays. Right? Some of us call like tomorrow, right? Tomorrow's a double Monday. You get the day off, right? So you get a double Monday, right? Maybe you're having a string of double Mondays. Maybe you're having a string of Mondays. Maybe a string of bad days. Maybe it might seem like the world's against you. Maybe it might seem in your world that you're beaten on and struggled. You can identify with the folks that Jesus hangs out with, the beaten up and the beaten down and the beaten on. And if you think that that's what your world is, and you think that there's no hope in this world and there's no promise, and what do I hang on to? It just seems that way. Because God has promises for you. And the two promises He has for you today is it's too good to be true. This thing called grace is too good to be true. And the promise He has for you today is peace. Is peace. This quietness and the stillness of the soul. That's the promise we have this day. Amen.